and then we can get going. So we started the recording. Thank you. So yeah, welcome. I am Abby Rose, the CEO of Vidacycle. I'm just going to introduce us a little bit here. We make apps that support observation as a key tool for understanding what works on a specific farm or vineyard. Many of you may already be familiar with Sector, which is our app for vineyards. So Sector makes it easy to predict yields, monitor ripeness, and understand soil health and biodiversity, as well as track many different vineyard activities, block by block, and much more. And then in November last year, we released the Regen dashboard in partnership with Nicole Masters, and that allows you to benchmark and track your regenerative viticulture journey using the 10 Regen indicators, as well as get tips and tricks from Nicole on how to improve them. So at Vidacycle, we're committed to building ecology, profitability, and beauty on farms around the world. And on that journey, we're always exposed to kind of amazing stuff that's happening on the ground. It's not always that easy to find just by searching online. And so not enough people get to hear about it. And especially some of the real implementation details of a regenerative approach. So this is about connecting the conversation, sharing knowledge, and then highlighting the work of Nick, Gill, and others as brilliant resources if you want to take a more regenerative approach. So I'm very excited to have Nick Gill here today. Such a pleasure to be talking to you, Nick. Just a little side note before I introduce Nick properly here, and that is, please do ask any questions in the Q&A area. You can ask questions throughout, but we're going to leave some time at the end to answer questions. So if you want to type them in as we go, they'll be visible to everyone, and then others can upvote questions by clicking on the thumbs up button if you want a question answered. Okay. So yeah, welcome, Nick. Nick has been at Greystone for the whole journey that Greystone has been on, from shifting from a conventional system to organic, and then to a regenerative organic system, as well as becoming certified carbon zero organization. So it's quite an amazing journey, really. And we've been following Nick's work for a while as one of the leading regen viticulturists in New Zealand. So Nick, you're actually becoming an independent regenerative advisor from September as you move on from Greystone. After a 20-year stint. So that's really a lot of learning and yeah, amazing kind of experience to be shared. And I really feel like it's great news. I mean, obviously amazing all you've done at Greystone, but it's also great news for the regenerative viticulture community in New Zealand, because now, Nick, you'll be able to share your knowledge further afield and really support others. So it's great to hear about this move. And to start, maybe you could just share a little bit about your background and also about the vineyard.
Thanks, Abby. Yeah, kia ora, everyone. So I now working in viticulture, but actually grew up in quite a hot, dry part of South Australia. So about 2 hours north of Adelaide, in an arable farming area, sort of 12-inch, 300 mm rainfall, really hot, dry summers, sandy soils. And that's what I've got my training in. But then I met my now wife, Angela, at university, and moved from arable farming to grapes in 1996. So I've been in grapes since then, and worked across South Australia and Victoria mostly, mainly with Penfolds and Seppels, and had like a lot of fun working with some really cool things like 130-year-old grapevines that were all planted quite sort of wobbly, because back then the horses would just walk, you know, next to the grapevine. It didn't need to be that straight. And also enormous blocks of bush vine grenache and stuff like that. And then really fortuitously got the opportunity to move to New Zealand to develop the Greystone Vineyard. So the Greystone Vineyard is in the South Island of New Zealand on the east coast, about halfway down the east coast, about an hour north of Christchurch. So moved from quite hot, dry environments to a cool climate viticulture region. Here we're about 600 mm rainfall. The Greystone Vineyard's mainly wind-blown low-sin clay over limestone, although a lot of North Canterbury grows some amazing fruit on really free-draining gravels, but we tend to have clay over limestone. and kind of go from about 60 meters above sea level to about 160 meters above sea level. So it is quite a hilly site. We've got quite a few slopes, which has presented its own range of challenges, both in conventional viticulture and organic viticulture as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually I was hoping to start there because I know that one of the reasons that really kickstarted you on a regenerative journey was after going organic. You started to do that under vine cultivation on the hillsides, and you got some serious soil erosion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everyone I've talked to that's gone, particularly from conventional to organic, you sell your undervine herbicide unit and buy a weeder, and then you just hammer it because you're like, well, I didn't used to have any weeds under vine, and I guess I shouldn't have any weeds under vine, So now I can't spray them, so I'm going to cultivate them. And of course, when you do that on slopes, and particularly the soil types we've got, once you've worked them up a little bit, they're not sodic, but they move really easily when they're at full capacity. And you can really quickly start getting some gully erosion and so forth. And on some of the blocks, which are steep enough that you can't really drive up them in anything but perfect conditions, you have to drive down them. Of course, we started getting soil moving down the row, and then you've got gully erosion, and then you've got your 3-ton tractor with your 3-ton sprayer, and you drop a wheel in that gully, and if that gully goes through the row, you're going through the row as well. So like the vineyard team at the time are like, this isn't working. It took probably 2 or 3 years for that to start to happen, but once it starts to happen, it's like, well, this is a real issue. So then the vineyard team started talking about how we're going to deal with this. And at the same time, we were becoming more aware of regenerative practices. And it really took probably a year of like talking about it and kicking the ideas around. So the almost like the tractor drivers were like, we just can't cultivate these blocks anymore. It's not going to work from a whatever point of view you want, safety point of view. The vines aren't doing well because they're getting their roots exposed, all this sort of stuff. So that made sense. So we reinstated the vine rows where we needed to, and then stopped cultivating them. But then of course we got weed growth, and in some blocks that's been an issue, and in other blocks it hasn't. And we've experimented with different sort of weeding systems and different mowing systems. Some of them we definitely still use some cultivation. Some of it's just understanding that some weeds are okay, and in some blocks, we've got some own rooted 20-year-old plus Chardonnay and Pinot. They're kind of the dominant life force in that vine row, and the weeds can't really get a foothold. But on some of the harder blocks, we still have to manage the weeds, and that's come with its own set of challenges and led to the vet team developing a few different solutions, including the trellis system where we can graze under the vines at any time.
Yeah, we will dig into some of the different solutions in a sec here. And I think one thing I just wanted to touch on here is you said, the 20-plus-year-old vines that are they're doing fine because they can compete, let's say. And this is something we did talk about is, that you have low vigor rootstocks in general across the site. And that maybe I was interested, what are your thoughts on low vigor rootstocks? And if you were starting again, would you plant high vigor going forward?
Yeah. So we've got the Greystone Vineyard, and then Greystone acquired Muddy Water in 2011, which is where the winery is, and that's got quite a few own-rooted vines. And for me, I think wines from own roots, I often think I prefer them. I think they have a better balance. They seem to perhaps age better and that sort of thing. But we've got phylloxera all around us. We haven't found it in North Canterbury that we know of, but we've got it in the region to the north and the region to the south. So Greystone was planted entirely on phylloxera-resistant rootstocks, and at the time, the owner said, grow me the best fruit you can, and a lot of the rootstocks were sort of chosen before I got to New Zealand. But we've got a hell of a lot of 101-14, and we're finding that rootstock in particular, when it gets in stressful conditions, whether it's frost or drought and so forth, it doesn't seem to do as well as some of the other ones. So I would probably be reluctant to do that. But definitely, if I was planting another vineyard now in an organic system, I'd be more on the high vigor side of rootstocks. And if I was going for what we've called high wire. I'd go for full like run, till I can't even remember what the high vigor rootstocks are called. I haven't used them for so long, but is it like Teleki and Cobra 5C, depending what country you're from, Richter, that sort of stuff. Used to be called Ramsey in Australia. So kind of wants to grow in a bucket of concrete, and then you've got this this engine that you can work with. Because although like we've got our most outstanding Chardonnay is Mendoza on RG, on Riparia Gloire on a really steep slope on limestone. But man, it took like 10 years to get it to crop anything, and now we'll never get that above 2 or 3 tons a hectare for sure. Like that would be its absolute maximum. So I think there's a lot to be said for high vigor rootstocks when you're running a low vigor sort of system. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess as we were talking about working with these soil erosion challenges, and we want to move towards having more plant cover, and then it just makes sense to have the high vigor to work with.
yeah. Then you've got something you can work with, and particularly like we've got a really great water consent, and it has another like decade in it. But I'm pretty sure that in the future, when things like that are reviewed, I would expect that air water take will be reduced. So can you make do with half the amount of water you've currently got in this changing climate, where just this last year we had 200-kilometre-hour winds in October. Like that's the highest wind speed we've ever dealt with, and it wasn't a tornado, it's just what we call the nor'wester, where you've got a high pressure to the west and a low pressure to the east, and it rushes off the mountains like a foam wind. But it was just dreadful. Like it just blew trees over and snapped them off and all the rest of it. And so we had that record-breaking wind, and then in mid-March we were -4. We were the coldest place in New Zealand on like the 14th of March or something, which is at the end of our growing season when we're trying to ripen the fruit. And we've all got these climate impacts coming at us, whether you're a farmer or you're just living your life. We're all in climate one way or another. So what sort of changes can we make in our system now to make it future fit kind of thing into the future? Water might be less, or maybe we'll have water, but electricity in New Zealand's going to be so expensive that we won't be able to pump very much, or something like that. Who knows?
So I wanted to move on to just talking about the trellising that you kind of referred to earlier, because I know you've experimented with many different ways of managing these vineyard blocks, and different approaches work different approaches work better in different areas. But my understanding was that actually you found that being able to integrate sheep into your vineyard system at any time of the year is hugely beneficial for Greystone, whether that's on hillsides or flat ground. So maybe can you tell us a bit more about that system and how that's evolved?
Absolutely. So it sort of followed on from that. Okay, we can't cultivate anymore if we let the weeds grow, apart from a couple of blocks. That's an issue for vines. There's different undervine mowers and things, but they're slow when they burn diesel. And a viticulturist at the time, Mike Saunders, and the team did a hell of a lot of work on how to integrate sheep into the vineyard at any time of year, so we can be confident that they're not going to eat any leaves we don't want them to eat, or the grapes. So we looked at a couple of different systems, and I think Kelly Mulville's used like hot wires and stuff, and it was just too much for us to manage at that scale. There's also a kind of horrific mask in Australia where the sheep, have you seen that one, when their head down, they can graze, and when it comes up, it puts a thing over their mouth, sort of thing, like Hannibal Lecter sort of cage. We didn't think that sort of aligned with their values, so we didn't do that. So the vineyard team worked on lifting one of their blocks, 1.5 hectares. They sort of cut one arm off it and took one of the cordons straight up and took it to the foliage wire at the top of the post, and took that to about 1.6 meters. And then started developing a cordon at 1.6 meters, where our normal cordon height is 1.1 roughly. And that was the first season, and we kind of just ran it. I think we called it rogue. We'd probably call it sprawl system along the top. So basically no canopy management, because you've run out of post height, right? Like we normally run VSP. We've got a 9-foot post, and we've got no, that's not right. 2.7 meter post and 1.8 out of the ground. So we've got really no post height left. So we just let it go, and that was Pinot and Riesling. And we had some issues to start with like fruit exposure and even ripening and stuff like that, but which can all totally be managed. But the grapevines themselves kind of loved it. Like they cropped really well, they looked really healthy. And we're trying to incorporate the regenerative principles into the vineyard where we can allow the sward to grow. We've got a little flock of sheep there, which have also been going into the cellar door restaurant, which is really neat. So we've got just a small flock of 60 that we can pulse in and out. And the idea is that not that we've got sheep in there all the time, but you're letting the sward grow, putting the sheep in, grazing it down by half or whatever, taking them out. And that's provided a hell of a lot of benefits. It's quite a hard block. The actual block was right next to a dam, and it had quite a big gully, and it was filled with subsurface clay. So the vines really struggled to get established for the first few years, and they've never been big, powerful vines, but they're performing really well. And the issues where we were having fruit variability with ripening and so forth. So the vineyard team worked with a local metal company to develop kind of like a white tea that went on the post, which is really similar and inspired by Kelly Mulville for sure. And it just helped to hold the canopy out, because what you're kind of finding is when you're running, we've got 8 different varieties. The main one is Pinot Noir, but we've got a lot of Pinot Gris and Chardonnay, and then lots of other bits and pieces like Riesling and Syrah and stuff. And like when they're in VSP, they all look the same, like because they got no choice. They're jammed into this freaking wall of green, and we've developed, and we're planting north-south, and we've developed this system to maximize sunlight exposure, and it wouldn't really matter what the grapevine looked like. By the time we've done that to it, it looks the same. But if you put it in this more natural system, you have to be able to work with the variety's natural habitat, and like left to its own devices, Sauvignon Blanc wants to stand up quite a lot, and Syrah's real floppy, and everything's in between. So you're dealing with all these things, which if you're perhaps working in a hot region where you're not running as many foliage wires and stuff, you might be aware of it. But there's a massive difference between the Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay's growth habits. So you're going to work more with the vineyard, the vine, and how it wants to grow, and perhaps be a bit more attuned to it. So we've just been working with Pinot Noir and Riesling at the moment, but I'm confident that if we did it with Sauvignon Blanc, it would look so different. So what we've found is, because we were using tractors to do the weeding, and we've been able to remove that, and we don't have to mow, obviously, and then we also don't have to do sucker removal, because the sheep are quite happy to eat them. So that's cut the tractor passes down by roughly half, because we don't have any of those, vineyard floor management ones,
Wow.
which has been pretty epic. And when we started doing carbon zero certification with Toy2, I didn't realize until we started that just how bad diesel is compared to even petrol. Like diesel's just, really bad. So really focused on reducing that, and that's been a great way to get diesel use down. And we sort of, when we're talking to people and showing people the vineyard, we're like, a lot of people have just come from Marlborough, and there's 85% of New Zealand's, wines are grown in Marlborough. And just imagine if we could get some vineyards like that, and a lot of them are still, mowing pretty regularly and doing their undervine passes and everything, whether it's herbicide or undervine mowing or weeding, and get more sheep into that system. Imagine the benefits that would come from it. At the moment, we've just had a really dry season, and the sheep farmers are just crying out for feed. We're trying to mow and control their weeds and their undervine canopy and everything like that. So yeah, Kiwis already know how to grow sheep, so you sort of integrate the two. And I think, there's even potentially benefits there in New Zealand, like kiwi fruit or something like that.
Yeah.
Or we've had interest from pome fruit growers like apples and so forth. So I think the idea could be incorporated, and you're able to start thinking about, you've got animals in your system, you're able to increase diversity with your plant sward, you can keep the cover on the soil and keep it protected. So there's lots of really good things that flow from it.
Totally. And I wonder, I guess you would ask them, well, why doesn't everyone just do this right away? Or like, why haven't you done it across all of the vineyard right away? So like, is it, you retrofitted the vineyard with this system, which is amazing. Yeah. So you didn't have to start again. But how big of a barrier is that to retrofit the system? Like the physical trellising and then also I feel like people have a bit of a fear of animals. If they're like viticulturists, this animal entity is scary, and that they'll eat the plants or they'll destroy things. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah. Because if you ask a viticulturist why they got into what they do, they'll say, like, because I love wine. They're not going to say, because I want to be a sheep farmer.
Yeah.
You know, so to do this well, you need someone in the team that is as passionate about sheep as your viticulturist is about wine. We were very fortunate that our viticulturist had a really strong farming background as well. But if you don't have that in the team, either allow it to be developed, or someone develops it, or bring it in, because definitely it's from the sort of infrastructure point of view, it's not that hard. Like the teas cost us roughly $10, and we've got 500 posts a hectare, so there's $5,000 of material, and you got to put them on. Probably for us, what stopped us doing it more is you do have a bit of a lag when you take them up that extra high. You know, you won't get it much fruit for a year or two, and you have to redevelop it. A couple of other things is we don't have harvesters that would be able to machine harvest those teas, so you're locked onto hand harvesting, which we hand harvest all our varieties apart from Pinot Gris and Sauvignon Blanc anyway. And I'm sure you could develop a machine harvester, but if you're really reliant on machine harvesting for the way you manage your costs, that will cut it out. But you've also removed all these tractor passes, all this cost of diesel, and so forth. You know, another thing that you haven't thought of until you go into vineyards, shorter people, the more vertically challenged people, can really struggle to work all day on these vines, because they're like 1.6, which is getting like quite high to have your hands up if you're shorter.
Yep.
And I think probably what we've learned is I wouldn't roll it across the vineyard site where there was low vigor, because I just think you're asking too much of the vines to get them up that high and do it.
Yeah.
But yeah, the other sort of issue from a winemaking perspective, we've definitely had some variability, but that seems to be settling down now with the tea system. And the more time you put into spacing the shoots out, and you could pin them in the wires and all the usual tricks you can do with grapevines to get them to behave how you want. You want them to be uniform, don't you? So they all ripen, you know, kind of, you know, at the same time, they have roughly the same sort of characteristics. So I think having an open mind is really important. You definitely have to be willing to leap into the unknown a little bit. But, you know, people like Kelly has been amazing. And there's other people out there and that are doing all sorts of different grazing systems. But I think, yeah, if you're going to integrate sheep or another animal into system, because like geese would be epic as well. Like we have a little permaculture property at home, and we established to wear trees without herbicide, and we use geese because 2 geese equals a sheep in grazing potential. But of course, geese can fly and all that sort of stuff. But you know, it doesn't have to be sheep.
No.
But whatever animal you put in, make sure you have someone in your team who knows how to wrangle them. Because for instance, when we started leaf plucking, we found, because a lot of vineyards in New Zealand will use sheep from after harvest through to the start of the growing season, maybe August or something, and winter grazing. And quite often the vineyards will charge the farmers to graze. So then the sheep farmer's paying quite a lot of money, and he won't necessarily want to spend too much time on his sheep. So he'll be trying to graze really hard too, because he wants to maximize how much food he can get for that money. So they'll be eating down into the dirt. So we work with the farmer who's always been next to our property for 20 years. We don't charge him very much, and the token of it is that he doesn't graze super hard. He's really happy to move the animals often, do really good fencing. And when you've got long vineyard rows, if you're using them for leaf plucking in, like for us would be January, February, you know, maybe having water at both ends, because we found if the sheep come into the block and they're thirsty, they'll go straight for the green grapes. So like understanding this little bit of sheep physiology and so forth is really important. And if you're into it, it makes the role of growing grapes and being a viticulturist even more rewarding. But, you know, if you're just really uber focused on wine grapes and wine styles and stuff, it would be like, oh, these animals are just doing my head in. So, you know, you have to already probably have that in your psyche or your capability of your team, I think. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, because I could just imagine if you didn't know much about sheep, or you hadn't got experience, and you saw them eating the grapes, you're like, right, the sheep eat the grapes, can't do this.
No,
Not,
like
just put water at both ends.
Yeah,
And so,
yeah. Really, like being a viticulture, so I like everything that we are passionate about. You know, it can be quite challenging, and if you put another challenge on top of it, it'd be like
yeah,
too much. So, yeah, understanding it's. You know, I'm really into diversity. Like I think systems with a high level of diversity have more resilience, but with diversity comes complexity. So, if you're going to start using these systems, understand you are also developing a highly complex system that requires a really high level of interaction with the system. So, you know, you don't need like an observation journal, although that would be awesome. But you know, and that's what something like Seek the Mentor would help with. But you know, when you're out in the vineyard in the property observing what the sheep are eating or what they've eaten, what they've left, all that sort of stuff, super important. And it's got to sort of all be in here somewhere, which is perhaps, you know, talking about the regenerative mindset and like how much work's done in the top paddock, as the Kiwi farmers call it, this bit, the top 6 inches. Yeah. So being open to trying different things, having those observations all the time, and understanding not everything's going to work. So if you're not sure, do a small thing and, you know, make it fail fast to learn from it and move on.
yeah, totally. Yeah, well, actually, that's maybe we can move on to you know, what I really got from the Greystone experience is that you have tried many different things and at small scales, and some things worked and some things don't. And you know, it is a bit of that question: how do you decide what is needed where? And I was wondering, yeah, for people who are maybe newer to this or maybe they just shifted to organics and they've realized they can't cultivate under vine, or starting out this journey, you know, what would you advise people who are just getting started exploring regen approaches? What do they do?
We have a saying here: paralysis by analysis.
Yeah.
You know that one, like we kind of overthink something so much you can't move. And like regenerative farming is a great catalyst for paralysis by analysis. So try to keep it simple in your head. And we even, you know, if you Google regenerative principles, the 5 regenerative principles, you get a few different versions, but they're all valid, right? Like, you know, no one's has to say, I'm doing it right and you're doing it wrong. It's just what works for you. So for us, they're regenerative principles that we try to come back to, and it's like, this system that's currently got this issue, how can we move it a little further along the continuum of regenerative principles? So, you know, reducing our reliance on cultivation, having animals in the system, how much diversity can we get in the system, having cover on the soil and keeping it protected, and minimizing our reliance on like chemicals and inputs, which obviously we're not using herbicides, but we still use like solid organic fertilizers. Sometimes we use compost. We use a lot of sulfur. You know, powdery mildew is our biggest issue. What can we do to reduce how much sulfur we use if we're using some copper for fungicide issues? You know, can we keep reducing the copper, because copper is obviously really good at killing things. So what I would suggest is, if you're trying to get started, do a bit of research on the regenerative principles. In like the New Zealand Farmer to Farmer led group Quorum Sense has a really great, that website has a really great like toolbox and all sorts of different things that you can click on and do some learning. There's a series of short videos on there from Greystone, but also if you're into other farming systems, you know, everything from dairy to sheep to cattle and arable and everything. So don't do a little bit of research, but don't do too much research, because you might not stop. Like do enough to get what you need, and put up your 5 regenerative principles that mean something to you, and then look at your farm or your garden or your vineyard or whatever you've got, and either look at a system that you've been seeking to change, or a problem area, and then look at your regenerative principles and decide on something that you can do reasonably easily. Because you've got, in like I love permaculture, and you've got Liebig's law of the minimum. Like, what's the thing that's holding you back, you know? Like I think for us locally, a big thing that we all have to deal with is frost. So we've all got frost protection systems and that sort of stuff. And then the next thing that was holding us back at the Greystone Vineyard was that soil erosion down the hill. So we had to stop cultivation. So, you know, whether you want to call it Liebig's law of the minimum, because that's the thing that's providing the biggest drag to your system, or because you want to call it the 80-20 rule, because if you fix that one, you're going to get the biggest impact, you know, however you want to think about it. but try that and do some trials and try some different things, and maybe don't just talk to viticulturists, talk to sheep farmers, talk to orchardists, talk to dairy farmers, whatever else grows in your region, because I'm a big believer that these farming systems, you know, they're all really closely interlinked, and I've learned so much talking to other regenerative farmers who aren't viticulturists.
Yeah,
Yeah,
totally.
but don't forget to keep watching what's happening, you know, because you can try it, and you know, natural systems have a bit of a lag, and that's where I think I said to you, you know, we stopped mowing under vine across the blocks, and some of them were fine, and some weren't. We've had to go back to, you know, some undervine cultivation, and we were getting too much loss of vigor and so forth. So you know, be aware that natural systems take a little while to change. Watch carefully, and if for you making observations and just you can kind of feel it in yourself, that's fine. Or some people, you know, would obviously, there's things like Sector or diaries and that sort of thing, and try to track what's changing. But you've got the climate and the seasons overlaid as well, so some of it comes down to gut feeling.
Yeah.
And also just like what farmer trials, so they're not replicated, they're not random. It's like you've got a couple of hectares of vineyard, and you know that this hectare here is pretty even, so you're going to apply one treatment to half a hectare and another treatment to the other half a hectare, and you're going to look at it, you get up on a hill or a drone or whatever and look at it, and which one worked better, you know, what's got a better color or better vigor or whatever, and that gives you a bit of a steer. And the regenerative farming community is really good at these sort of just farmer-led learnings, and yeah, there's not the research to back it up, and it's not replicated, but you know, then if you do some of those things for long enough, then the science community does come along and says, gee, that's pretty interesting. Do you want us to have a look at that for you? And that's really cool.
Totally. Yeah, I've seen that pattern many times from the regenerative perspective. Okay, great. Yeah, I think that is really helpful. And I think I've definitely found the 5 or 6 soil health principles are an amazing thing to keep coming back to, and to really channel the mind and help to think, well, what lever could I pull here to help me? Okay. And then the other thing I wanted to, I guess, kind of expanding on this regenerative, what is regenerative in a way, is that you have also been thinking about, well, how does that extend into the winemaking? Yeah, maybe you could talk a little bit about, I know you've explored, what does it mean to be regenerative in the vines and then with the wine? So yeah, what does that look like?
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting conversation. And I don't think the wine industry, to the best of my knowledge, has really got to the bottom of regenerative in the winery yet. So we just didn't do it in the winery and did it in the vineyard instead. so back in 2012, the winemaker who I've worked with since the start of Greystone, Dom Maxwell, became really aware of some studies that were showing how vineyard, yeast fermentations were so different to the winery fermentations. And we use mostly wild ferments in Greystone, but of course you've always got those commercial yeasts in the winery, for whether it's for clients or it might have been a Riesling firm, whatever it was. And they're so aggressive. They're all from the Northern Hemisphere. They produce their own range of flavors and aromas and all the rest of it. So we decided to ferment Pinot Noir in the vineyard block. So what we do nowadays is we hand pick it, put it straight through a tiny destemmer, and it goes straight into the fermenter in the block. It only gets a really gentle plunge by hand, and then we just put a lid on it at night, basically. It finishes fermentation, and then we take it back to the winery for pressing, so it doesn't get to the winery until it's finished. And what it has definitely done, and this is an example where kind of a kooky idea ends up getting studied by the scientists, and they tell you what's really happening. They always come out low alcohol. They always come out much more aromatic and quite different wines to what the estate wines made in a winery are. And the yeast population is different, but one of the biggest differences is there's no temperature control, of course. So we're just putting it outside, and it's got a super thin jacket on it, and that's all. So if it's a really hot season, it could be fermenting within 12 hours and finished in 3 days. And then we've had really cold years where it cold soaked for 10 days, and then it hardly, it took ages to get started, and then it was out there for weeks and weeks and weeks, and it fermented really slowly and, completely different. And people freak out and say, oh, how do you control that? Or like what, the vintage variation is just epic because it's actually weaving the season's temperature into the winemaking equation, which is really interesting. So I don't know if it's regenerative, but it's kind of taking the natural, it's allowing nature to almost drive your winemaking process and the metabolic pathways and all those sorts of things. And the wines are all really different. Every year we get an artist to draw sort of her impression of the vineyard from that year. And then we always we allow, when we're in the cellar door, you can compare it to the estate, and they're such vastly different wines. So I don't know. I'm not sure that that's regenerative. I think it's just another layer of making sure the vineyard can speak really truthfully in the wine. But yeah, I'd be interested to know if anyone else has come up with what regenerative means in the winery. You know, obviously we're doing everything we can to have sustainable practice and be really careful with their water management and their electricity use, and, you know, how we use their cooling and all that sort of stuff. But, you know, that's sustainable, but is it regenerative? I'm not sure. So yeah, I think we've still got some work to do there. Personally, that's what I think in regenerative winemaking. Yeah.
Totally. And how have people like responded, I guess? Is it, you know, I would assume it's a great story, and also kind of exciting way to experience a vintage in a way.
Yeah, it is. And it really is our USP. Like, I think if you look at, you know, lots of really successful wineries, you'll have a backstory which will be, you know, we're passionate about wine and we want to represent the vineyard and all this sort of, you know, they're all a little bit similar, but for us the Vineyard Ferment really is a unique wine. Like, we're not aware of anyone else doing it quite like that. In the way, obviously the wines at Georgia, where they used to bury the amphora and stuff in the ground, it's kind of those skin ferment wines maybe, but so yeah, there's a lot of interest. I think people often don't really understand what we're talking about until we can take them out and show them a fermenter in the vineyard. Like, wine people, sure, they're like, oh, that's kooky, fermenters in the vineyard, got it. But like, if you're a normal consumer, and, you know, most of the people we sell our wines to are wine lovers and consumers, not wine industry people. So we make sure we've got lots of assets, whether it's social media or photographs and stuff, and we can explain it to people. And I think when you look at say the 2021 Vineyard Ferment at the moment compared to the estate, and the difference in the wines is just, it's blindingly obvious, even if you've never tried wine before. I think it's quite accessible to people. They can see it easily. You don't have to be a seasoned wine judge who can find these tiny little nuances between these two wines. They're glaring, they're massive. And I think that accessibility is really cool because, you know, part of great wine is being able to share it with everyone, right?
Totally. Yeah, and to really, yeah, for me, I think it is exciting to be able to have that variability and to understand it as someone who's not necessarily understanding all the fine nuances that the very best wine tasters could draw out. So I think that is. And then I just want to say to people, we're going to go to questions in a few minutes here. So if you do have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A area. If you don't have any questions, that's fine. I have loads of questions, so that's not a problem. But if you do, make sure you ask them now, because otherwise it'll run out of time. And then I just wanted to talk about, we talked a bit about the kind of the other aspect to what you found really worked is the subterranean irrigation. And yeah, maybe you can talk a little bit about what it takes to implement that, and why, what have the benefits been?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got some younger blocks around about 5 hectares that we planted in 2020, and they've got subsurface irrigation. At the time, when we went from conventional to organic, and the weeding equipment was hitting a lot of the drip lines, so all our blocks have drip irrigation. And back then that was about probably 30 or 40 centimeters above the ground, and then the weeders and the brushes and everything were hitting it, so we had to lift it, which is quite a big job to lift. You know, it's 4 kilometers for us, 4 kilometers per hectare, so whatever it is, 200 kilometers of, you know, restapling drip lines, which everybody's got better things to do with their lives. So then when we developed some new blocks, there was the opportunity there with the vet team, Mike and the guys decided to go underground with subsurface drip irrigation. And nowadays you can get really good. So I'm a really big fan of the Netafim products. and the drippers have a piece of copper in them that prevent root incursion. Whereas when I first used subsurface irrigation in the 90s in Australia, every dripper either had a piece of, almost like a piece of herbicide in it, or you had herbicide impregnated filters, which is pretty nasty, and obviously nobody wants to be doing that. But the subsurface irrigation is great because it's out of the way. You're not irrigating the weeds, you're not allowing weeds to germinate. You know, ours is buried about 25 centimeters, so what's that, 10 inches down. I know Nick Pullen, really interestingly, was saying the other week, he's put it in the middle of the row, which has a lot of benefits because it just wouldn't get damaged there from cultivation, I don't think. Whereas ours is on the edge of the wheel track, on the vine edge of the wheel track. We were a bit concerned. We've got some really heavy clays, and we were a bit concerned that they might struggle to get through the wheel track to the water. But of course, there's the other side of it that might make them go through the wheel track to the water. But yeah, really efficient for irrigation. The downsides are you can't see it working, obviously, so you have to have a lot of confidence in your system design and your install, because you can't check if water's coming out of the ends very easily. And probably making sure that you've got some really good soil moisture monitoring gear, or at least an idea of how that block needs to be irrigated, because you just don't have those visual cues as well. But I'm still just a really big fan of like either a spade or what we call a dig stick, you know, like a core tube that is kind of elliptical when you hammer it into the ground and twist it, and you can probably get out to maybe 2 feet of soil. And just checking for soil moisture conditions and that sort of thing. But if I was going to develop a vineyard now, I'd definitely be, I'd do the high wire, but I'd use really high posts. So I do have almost like VSP options at height, although I don't know, you'd need like giants to do the wire. So I don't know how that would work, but but at least you've got options then. High vigor rootstocks and subsurface irrigation for sure. Yeah, and with the sheep, they can graze across the vineyard more easily, and you get a better grazing pattern, because when you've got the drip line there, it kind of makes a little low fence for them, and they can sort of bang through it, but they also tend to damage it and stuff. And without the drip line above the ground at all, you don't get any sheep damage. We have a problem with hares here, you know, like big rabbits, hares.
Yep.
And when it's really dry, they chew the drip line because it gets salt deposits on it, and they can make a hell of a lot of damage chewing the drip line. So all those issues disappear, and you get a better grazing pattern. No damage from like undervine weeders or brushes or anything like that. So yeah, I think it's pretty cool. It obviously costs a little bit more to install, and you have to have good soil conditions. And if you do get a leak, it's kind of a bollocks to fix, because you got to dig up a section. But you know, you probably won't get a leak if it's installed well. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that, the 3 aspects there that kind of come together for a system that, after all of your experiences, you feel like those 3 key aspects would really work in a new environment. And yeah, I guess they kind of form that ecosystem that underpins a regenerative approach.
Yeah.
I just wanted to dig into, because we didn't talk about this before when we were talking about the sheep, but you kind of referenced it there. I'd love to dig in a little more into the actual grazing, and also the undervine cover that allows those sheep to prosper, let's say. Did you have to, did you just allow whatever to come through, or do you have to seed? How do you do that?
Yeah, so when the vineyard was established, you know, when you establish a vineyard, it's usually too bumpy, so you got to work it down flat. And then we sowed it with sort of species that would grow over winter and not over summer, because we have quite dry summers. And then they sort of petered out. And then when we became more aware of the regen principles, we've got a Duncan vineyard seeder, which is a New Zealand made vineyard seeder with really good coulters and press wheels, really good at putting seed in the slot. And that's one of the things that we have absolutely honestly struggled with is organic regenerative viticulture, you know, how you terminate your plants and re-establish a new set of plants without cultivating the soil. And we haven't been able to work out how to do it. Like I said to you, our property at home, the food farm, I got perfect soil conditions. I packed a whole heap of sheep and cows in a small area. I broadcast seed basically in the rain at a really heavy rate. They ate all the grass, ate it down to the boards, and then they walked all over it. But because a lot of their grass and plant weed species are perennial, they just repower so fast that the seeds kind of germinate, but then they're just lost in there. So we have had to cultivate. We can't use herbicide, so we've had to cultivate to get cover crops established. We try to minimize that, and then we try to plant a mix that's got a mixture of annuals and perennials in it that we know will do well, and then the perennials will kind of proliferate, and we're hoping that we won't need to resow it for at least a few years. When we first started doing it, we were using like the 20 species mix or something, but some of them just didn't really, we never saw them really. So we've fallen back to a much shorter mix now. So in the legumes, you've got tip beans and a couple of different types of clovers. The grasses, we don't sow too many grasses because we've got a lot of grass already, but oats and rye corn, sunflowers, because everybody loves the sunflower. Phacelia and buckwheat. Like Phacelia is one of those things that does seem to just come up in the most awkward conditions, and it still comes up. And then like we've got quite heavy soils. Amazing how well daikon can do, like the big tillage radishes, you know, punching down like, or sort of nearly half a meter sometimes. They're really long, and then of course if the animals don't graze them, that rots away and leaves an enormous soil pore. And sunflowers, they really are amazing how well they can grow in tough conditions. And I've always been amazed, you know, they're a frost tender plant, and if a big paddock of sunflowers gets frosted, it's pretty obvious. But I've noticed when they're growing in a mixed sward, they can cope with frost a lot better. Like you'll go well below 0 degrees C, might be -1 or something. And the ones where you've got them dotted through the vineyard with all these other plants, they don't get frosted. And it's quite interesting, yeah, which it comes down to that concept of quorum sensing and all that sort of stuff, which I don't understand, but being part of a community instead of monoculture, I think. But so we have to cultivate to get them established. We sow every second row and try to traffic the other ones for spraying. We're using a mix of annuals and perennials. They are all highly palatable, and some of them grow back after the sheep have grazed them and some don't. Like if you eat the top off a sunflower, most of them won't do anything again. But you know, some, obviously the clovers and those sorts of things are fine, they just reshoot. But when you're not, and Nick mentioned this as well, when you're trying to grow a really big sward for the soil health and then you want to cut it high, there's certain times of year where you've got a lot of people working the vineyard. It's just really hard on them. Like if it's you know, a wet vintage or something, and you've got your pickers going through waist high stuff, you know, and they're wet, it's no good. So sometimes you just got to say, you know, I've done what I can here. I'm going to drop that onto the ground so my humans can get through it okay, and you know, go again. So again, that's just being flexible, I think. Yeah.
Yep. And have you found with the grazing of the sheep, is it are you experimenting with doing kind of, is it mob grazing tactics?
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah, so I did. Yeah, so in the high wire block, that's definitely mob grazing. So like crash it in and crash it out as much as we can. We often, to be honest, don't have enough sheep.
Okay.
So with this last growing season we've just finished has been El Nino, and before that we had 2 La Ninas, and it's been just amazing. If you're using sheep a lot in the vineyard, the difference has been incredible. Like the previous season, we put sheep into a block and they had to be there for 3 days to eat all the food on the ground before they started plucking the leaves.
Yep.
Whereas this year it took 12 hours.
Oh.
Yeah, like because there was no grass there because it was too dry, and just straight in, up on the leaves. Leaves are done, get them out before they start eating grapes. So that's where their observations are really important. Oh God, what was it? What did you ask me about? I've lost my train of thought.
I asked about mob grazing and the sheep.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, so mob grazing is definitely what we try to do. But sometimes we just don't have enough sheep, and you've got like 60 sheep wandering around for way too long. At home, where I do a similar thing, I move them twice a week, so every 3 days. But you know, it'd be great if you had enough so that you could move them every day or two. But then, like in a vineyard situation, you're talking about a shepherd position. Like then you've got a shepherd on your team, which is obviously an additional cost and skill set and everything. So it's got to be a bit of a balancing act, but definitely get them in as a cell or a mob and stack it in and get them out. That's what we try to do within the constraints of how many sheep we can access. And like sometimes the fencing's a real bollocks and sometimes it's really easy. So it depends what it's like. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask, because obviously I'm assuming then, are they setting up electric fencing? So
Yeah,
some
yeah,
blocks within the blocks, so there's electric fencing for little areas and then moving.
absolutely. A lot
Okay.
of electric fencing. Yeah. So electric fencing was developed in New Zealand, I think, by a Kiwi farmer who got annoyed with the cows licking his favorite car, so he electrified it. Something like that. And I think the original one is called Waikato. But yeah, like the farmer we work with and the guys that work the sheep, they're like electric fencing artists. Like, you know, they'll go up and down and over things and under corners, and it's all running beautifully. And that's also part of being sheep farmers, is understanding, you know, how to set up those systems and how to, because if you're good at it, they make it look really easy, and they'll move kilometers of fence in a couple of hours. There's even like agri sports here where they do it competitively, like how fast can you move a fence? But if you don't know what you're doing, you just get it in a massive tangle and it's not tight enough and the sheep get out where they shouldn't be. So that's where you've got this entirely different skill set operating within a vineyard, and either being willing to do that or willing to learn it, or bring someone in that is really keen on sheep and enjoys wine as well, or something like that. But it's got to be on point, because otherwise it'll just fail.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think one thing that's always interesting, and I feel like everyone has a different opinion on this, but if you were to, so going back to like, if you were to just start out, would you, and obviously we've talked about there are the 5 soil health principles, and animals is one part of that. So there's no definite answer, but just from your experience, do you think the more it's better to kind of try and start with the animal side of things, or is it actually better to start with the ground cover and underlying maintenance and then bring the animals in later? Because of the complexity, I guess, of
Yeah,
managing.
I would definitely do it like that. I would get you sort of your, obviously bear the animals in mind and which animal you're going to use. And you know, hopefully we've got listeners from all over the world. Like maybe you can have capybaras or something. I don't know. You know, it doesn't have to be sheep. And think about, well, I know this is the natural sort of behaviors that capybaras do. So how am I going to design my vineyard around that? Get your vineyard established first, and your vines in and up and all that sort of stuff, and then start putting your capybaras in.
Great. Okay, so I just one last question from me is, you know, taking this all into account, and in your kind of, as you're thinking about the future of regenerative viticulture specifically, you know, where do you see this all going, and what, I guess, what are you excited about?
I think like the traditional vineyard, certainly the vineyard I learned in was a monoculture. And a monoculture was highly desirable, is actually what was required. You know, you'd sort of get in trouble if you didn't have a monoculture. And I think this is an opportunity, one, to move away from that and have diversity in vineyards, and understanding that, you know, whether it's your agricultural system or your soil system or your economic system, diversity is going to help it. So I'm quite excited by seeing vineyards, and all sorts of vineyards, not just organic ones, but like conventional vineyards and stuff. There's lots of people playing with, you know, cool cover crop mixes, or extending the boundaries of when they've got sheep in the vineyard, or, you know, going, oh, I was talking to someone the other day, and they would normally use, you know, like 6 roundups a year or something, to spray on the vine. And they've dropped one out and there's some weeds there. And I actually think that's cool, because like, I don't like Roundup at all, but hey, they've got from 6 to 5, and then the next step's going to be 4, hopefully. And so, you know, I think we should really encourage that sort of positive thinking. I think there's a lot of research to show that consumers worldwide, not just in wine, but products, are really interested in regenerative principles. So you've got that consumer, we won't say pressure, we'll say influence, coming to the production systems, you know, and we have it. We're not certified regenerative, not yet. I'd love to be, but not yet. But we do have really close interactions with customers, whether it's stores or distributors, saying, tell us about what you do, that are regenerative practices. And then that's an opportunity to have another chat with someone, and they become, you know, almost like a friend, and you develop a close relationship. So I think a lot of it, I try to sort of focus on a couple of things. And one of the things I really try to focus on in my life is diversity. And, you know, it's an opportunity to get diversity into the Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc model. Like, you know, love it. And it has driven this country's wine futures forwards very, very clearly. But I wonder if it might be a little brittle, that system. Like it has this one grape and this one style doing this one thing.
Yeah.
And a lot in that area used to be epic sheep farming area. So, you know, and it's another income stream for people. So yeah, I think the excitement for me is being able to get diversity into these systems which have been lacking diversity for a long time. And I'm hopeful that with all the challenges we've got coming at us with climate and that sort of stuff, that it will be able to see that diversity is going to help sort of get through those challenges. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I love this vision for the Marlborough, the Sauvignon Blanc, and just even
6 foot up
yeah.
teas. Yeah, teas are this funny. There used to be, I was at the biggest Chardonnay vineyard in Australia in the 90s, and they had lots of tea trellis because it was just an opportunity to get, it was horrific Chardonnay. We put it in road trains, and if it wasn't full, you just fill it up with water straight out of the Murray River and send it to the winery like it was just rubbish. But they had beaters that beat up underneath the teas. So, you know, you'd be able to machine harvest white teas. Maybe in 20 years' time, Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, you know, we're all trying to reduce their carbon emissions, and it's going to be a combination of some vineyards will be really low, run by robots, and some vineyards will be really high with sheep underneath them, and these harvesters from the 1970s working, and who knows? But I'm sure it's going to look different.
I'm sure it will look different too.
Yeah, because you've got people working on the robots and stuff. I definitely prefer to work with living things, but you know, that's a whole nother story. But robots and electricity and that sort of stuff is pretty fascinating. Yeah,
totally. And I'm all about working with living things as well. Very exciting. It's much more exciting. Okay. Thank you so much, Nick. That was brilliant. Really appreciate digging into all the different aspects. And I mean, in particular, I think for me anyway, the retrofitting of a vineyard to have this ability to work with sheep all year round, I think that's, well, from my experience, is relatively unique. And so it's really exciting to share that knowledge here and to let people know, you know, what it takes to do that. And as I said at the beginning, you're soon to be independent regenerative advisor. So, you know, people can reach out to you. We'll send a follow-up email. So we'll make sure that we include your details in that.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah.
And for people listening, if you're interested to hear more about Sector Mentor, you can email us on info@vidacycle.com. And yeah, we'll send a follow-up email early next week with the video of this recording and links to find out more about Nick's work. And we're going to do one more Regen Viti series it's actually next month. It'll be on July 3rd, and that will be with Felix Egora in Canada. And we're also going to be bringing together all of the Regen Viti series that we've recorded so far into a single resource so that people can easily watch all the great sessions. And hopefully, I feel like there's not that many practical places that you can go find about implementation of Regen viticulture and what people are doing on the ground. So that's hopefully a support for that. So thank you so much. Someone's just put through a question, but it's too late. But thank you so much. And we'll tune in again soon. Thanks so much, Nick.
Thank you. Yeah. Any other questions, find my email and send them through. That'd be awesome.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We'll send your email along afterwards. Great. Okay. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
To you.